Brooke lay flat against the cold grit of a half-collapsed retaining wall, the jagged concrete pressing through her uniform. The air smelled of dust and river spray, a mixture that clung to the back of her throat. Through her scope, she studied the fractured bridge ahead, the skeleton of steel girders stretching above the rushing water. One half of the structure leaned downward into the river like a broken limb, while the other jutted into the air in a mess of angled rebar and cracked roadway. Her crosshairs swept the far bank, catching brief bursts of muzzle flash from the upper windows of a ruined building. The flashes came in a disciplined rhythm, each burst cutting off any movement from the two Allied soldiers pinned beneath the central span. They were trapped in a small pocket of debris under the bridge, crouched low among slabs of broken roadway. From her angle, she could see the desperation in the way they hugged cover, the way they kept their heads down, even when the shooting paused. The enemy had a perfect view of that pocket, and one wrong move would bring fire down on them instantly. She shifted slightly, letting the scope's edge trace the contours of the collapsed span. The underside was a chaos of steel and stone, dangling rebar swaying in the wind, fractured beams twisting into each other like roots of some dead tree. The sunlight was cut into thin, sharp slants by the wreckage, catching floating dust in brief golden patterns before fading back into shadow. Beneath it all, the river churned violently, its roar constant, drowning out smaller sounds and making her radio connection patchy. Every few seconds, she felt a vibration through the ground when a stronger current slammed against the surviving supports. Her mind ran through options, dismissing most of them as quickly as they appeared. The suppressors' positions were too well covered for her to get a clean line from here. She could try moving along the bank, but the exposed stretch would be a death sentence. There was only one path that offered even a sliver of hope: the partially buried maintenance ladder at the base of the bridge's collapsed section. From there, she might crawl under the wreckage, find a concealed perch inside the ruined structure, and come at the enemy from an angle they would not expect. She lowered the scope and let her eyes adjust to the naked view, studying the shapes in front of her without the glass in between. The bridge itself seemed to pulse with tension, every groan of its wounded frame a reminder that it could give way at any moment. Yet, in its ruin, she saw possibility. The steel beams, the broken platforms, the tangle of shadows and light. These could be her cover if she moved carefully enough. The very thing that trapped her allies might shield her approach if she read the structure correctly. The retaining wall where she lay was cracked and spalling, its edge littered with flakes of concrete. She ran a gloved hand over the rough surface, feeling its chill. This position gave her safety for now, but the moment she left it, she would be stepping into uncertainty. The ladder she needed was halfway buried in rubble and angled steeply down, vanishing into darkness under the span. She imagined the crawl ahead, low space, metal pressing against her sides, the constant risk of debris breaking loose above her. It would be a test of both patience and nerve. Through the scope again, she checked the enemy's firing rhythm, counting seconds between bursts. 3 suppressors at least, all rotating their fire to keep the trapped soldiers pinned. They were disciplined, which meant they were not likely to abandon their positions on a whim. If she could make it into the underside without being spotted, she might be able to line up shots that would open an escape route. Timing would be everything. And any mistake would mean not just her life, but the lives of those she was here to protect. A fresh burst from the far windows sent chips of concrete spinning from the pocket where the Allies hid. One of them shifted, perhaps to shield the other, and Brooke caught a glimpse of a bandage stained dark against his sleeve. The sight settled her decision. She would not wait for the enemy to press harder. The situation would only get worse the longer they stayed exposed. She checked her gear with deliberate motions, keeping her movements tight against the wall. The scope lens was wiped clean. Ammunition was where she needed it. Her rifle sling was snug, sidearm in place, water secure. She let her breathing steady, the river's rush filling her ears. The sunlight above shifted, briefly brightening the dust-filled air, then slid behind cloud again. It felt like the bridge itself was holding its breath with her. Her gaze returned to the ladder. It was a narrow, rust-streaked frame leading into a space that looked barely wide enough for her to fit. But in that darkness, she might find the one vantage point that could turn this fight. She pictured the angles in her mind, mapping the potential line of sight she could gain if she found the right opening among the beams. Even a small gap could be enough if she placed her shots well. The roar of the river deepened as the wind shifted, carrying a faint mist toward her. The droplets cooled her skin, a subtle reminder of how close the water was. Somewhere above, a loosened fragment of concrete fell, hitting the river with a muted splash. The structure was alive in its own way, groaning, creaking, resisting its final collapse, and she intended to use every part of it. She exhaled slowly, letting her eyes trace the path she would take from here to the ladder. It was a short dash, but one that had to be perfectly timed between the suppressor's bursts. Every step would be exposed, yet the plan was clear in her mind now. The bridge was no longer just a hazard. In the right hands, it could be the shield that delivered them all to safety. Brooke shifted her weight against the retaining wall and began stripping down to what she needed most. The pack came off first, set aside in the dust. She kept her rifle, 2 spare magazines, a canteen, and her sidearm. Each was clipped or strapped tight so nothing would snag when she was deep inside the broken structure. The heavier gear stayed behind. Extra weight could slow her crawl and make noise in the wrong moment. Every ounce mattered now. She slid toward the partially buried maintenance ladder, eyes locked on the far bank's shattered windows. The suppressors were still firing in steady rotation, a mechanical rhythm of violence. She counted their intervals under her breath, letting the pattern sink in. The dash to the ladder had to fall in the precise lull between bursts. She inhaled, stepped clear of the wall, and moved low and fast. Concrete dust kicked up under her boots. By the time the next burst came, she was crouched at the ladder's top, hidden again in shadow. The ladder's metal was streaked with rust, the rungs slick with grime. She placed her boots carefully to avoid loose debris lodged between the steps. The frame groaned under her weight as she descended into the bridge's underside. The air grew cooler and thick, with the scent of wet stone and oxidized steel. The light above fractured into narrow slices, catching the edges of suspended dust. Every sound was sharper here. Her gloves rasped against the ladder, and the echoes of gunfire above rang metallic, more like hammer strikes than distant shots. At the bottom, the ladder ended in a mound of rubble where the collapsed section met the surviving span. Brooke crouched, sliding onto her stomach to squeeze through a low gap between 2 fractured beams. Her elbows dug into grit as she inched forward. Loose concrete shifted under her weight, making the metal above her groan. The space was narrow enough that her rifle scraped against the walls when she moved. She kept its muzzle forward, resting it across her forearm so she could slide it ahead with each shift of her body. The river's roar was a constant backdrop, but here it was joined by smaller, sharper sounds, the tick of debris falling from overhead, the faint hiss of wind through narrow openings, the metallic ping of a ricochet striking somewhere too close. Twice she froze when chips of stone fell past her cheek, dislodged by bursts of fire hitting the span above. The dust stung her eyes, but she kept her breathing slow and shallow, letting each pause in the enemy's rhythm dictate her next push forward. She reached a junction where 2 main beams met at an angle, forming a small triangular chamber. From here, the space split in 2 narrow directions. One path sloped upward toward brighter light. The other dipped lower, disappearing into darkness. She listened for a full firing cycle before moving. Above her, footsteps clanged faintly on steel. The enemy was shifting, but the suppressors kept their steady work. She chose the darker path, knowing it would likely lead closer to the bridge's structural core, where she could climb higher unseen. The crawl became more difficult as the ceiling pressed closer to her back. She had to turn her head sideways to avoid catching her helmet on the beams, though even then, The fit was tight. Her boots brushed rebar that stuck out at odd angles, and she angled her legs to avoid catching on it. The air felt heavier here, warmer from the heat trapped between the layers of concrete and steel. Every move was deliberate, her senses tuned to the faintest creak or shift above. Halfway through, she spotted a slab of concrete hanging overhead, its edge balanced on a thin brace of steel. The brace trembled faintly with each shot fired above. She studied it for a moment, noting how a few well-placed hits might bring it down. It was unstable, but not yet ready to fall on its own. She marked its location in her mind. If the enemy tried to push across this section, she could make that slab work in her favor. The farther she went, the more she felt the bridge enclosing around her. The groans of its frame were deeper now, like something straining to hold itself together. Sunlight reached her only in rare, fleeting moments through narrow cracks above, painting thin bars of brightness on the debris-strewn floor. Each flicker passed quickly, replaced by shadow, as if the bridge itself were closing its grip. Her movements were slow but steady, each advance made during the safe beats between enemy fire. She reached another junction, this one with a partial gap in the debris above. The opening was small, but it offered a brief view of the far bank through twisted rebar. She could see the corner of the building where one suppressor had been firing. The angle was poor now, but it confirmed she was drawing closer to where she needed to be. The crawl's discomfort faded into the background, replaced by the focus of nearing her objective. The rumble of the river grew louder, echoing strangely in the confined space. It seemed to come from multiple directions, bouncing off the steel walls and masking smaller sounds. That noise could work for her later, covering the sound of her movements or shots. For now, it made it harder to hear the enemy, forcing her to rely more on timing than on subtle cues. She kept counting seconds in her head, staying disciplined even when her muscles ached from holding still. Finally, she felt a change in the air. A faint draft brushed her cheek, cooler than the air she had been breathing. That meant an opening was near. She slid forward another meter, her rifle gliding ahead of her, and saw the faint glow of sunlight spilling over a pile of debris. Beyond that light, the beams angled upward toward a space that could be her vantage point. The path was still dangerous, but it was the only one that might give her the line she needed. She paused in the shadows, steadying her breathing before the last push. This was the point of no return. Brooke eased upward, careful not to let her boots dislodge the loose debris at her back. The beams here angled together in a narrow triangular pocket, the fractured edge of the roadway above forming a slanted roof. She tested the footing before committing her weight, finding a brace of steel that would hold. The climb was slow, her rifle held tight to her chest until she could wedge herself into place. When she finally settled in the niche, her knees were jammed against cold concrete, her shoulder pressed into the beam's edge. The vantage point was better than she had hoped. From here, the enemy's flank came into view through a lattice of broken rebar and twisted steel. The position allowed her to see without exposing herself to the sky or the far bank. She was buried deep enough that the shadows hid her entirely, the light falling in broken patterns across the wreckage. She could see the roof lines and shattered windows where the suppressors had been firing. She slid her pack off her shoulder and pulled free a length of torn safety netting she had taken from the collapsed section earlier. The fibers were dusty and stiff, some strands frayed, but they would break up her outline against the concrete and steel. She draped it over the front of her position, tucking the edges into jagged gaps so it would not shift. A few pieces of loose debris went on top to make it look like part of the ruin. From the far bank, it would just be another patch of wreckage. The river's voice was lower here, its roar muted, but constant. The sound mingled with the occasional groan of steel shifting above her, each creak a reminder that the structure was still under strain. She adjusted her rifle into a narrow gap between two beams. testing her field of view. Through the scope, she picked out the first suppressor's firing position, a crouched figure braced in the upper window of the far building. The second was lower, behind a stack of sandbags near the bridge approach. The third was further out, almost hidden by the corner of a collapsed warehouse. She pulled out her rangefinder, bringing it to her eye despite the harsh glare from sunlight bouncing off the water. The readings confirmed her estimates. Each target was within reach, but the angles were tight. Any missed shot could reveal her position. And moving in this confined space would be slow. She let her breathing settle, counting the seconds between the enemy's bursts, watching for patterns in how they shifted their aim. The crosswind was subtle but steady, funneled by the ravine in which the river ran. She adjusted her scope's windage to compensate, then checked elevation for the varying distances between targets. It was meticulous work, done in near silence except for the creaks and sighs of the bridge around her. A thin beam of sunlight slipped through the wreckage above, striking the side of her scope before shifting away. She kept her head low to avoid any reflective glint that might give her away. Her body was already beginning to feel the strain of the position. The concrete pressed uncomfortably into her knees, and the cramped angle forced her elbows in tighter than she liked. Still, she remained steady. The niche was secure, hidden, and gave her what she needed most: choice. From here, she could decide when to act, rather than reacting to the enemy's fire. The control was almost physical, a quiet weight in her hands as she kept her rifle trained. Through the beams, she studied the far bank for movement beyond the three primary targets. Small shifts caught her attention: the flicker of a helmet in a shadowed doorway, the quick duck of a figure moving between cover. The suppressors were not alone, though these other figures were either spotters or waiting for an opportunity to push forward. Their coordination would falter if the suppressors fell quickly enough. That would be her task, executed with precision and speed. She pressed the torn netting more firmly into place, layering it with bits of gravel and small concrete fragments to ensure nothing flapped in the wind. The effect was convincing even from just a few feet away. The smell of dust and old steel was strong here. The air stale, except for the occasional cool draft slipping in through the cracks. She welcomed that faint movement of air. It was the only relief from the stillness. The sound of the river, the shifting steel, and the distant bursts of gunfire created a strange rhythm. She found herself breathing in time with it, letting it keep her calm. Her eyes moved from one suppressor position to the next, rehearsing the sequence in which she might engage them. The high ground here was not about height alone. It was about angles, concealment, and patience. If she rushed, she would lose the advantage the niche offered. Another flicker of sunlight cut through the debris above, warming the side of her face for a moment before disappearing. She watched it fade, noting how the light's movement might at some point illuminate an enemy position and give her a shot. Even in stillness, the battlefield shifted. She would wait for those shifts, taking them when they came. This was her ground now, and she would hold it until the moment to strike arrived. Brooke stayed still for several breaths, her rifle balanced steady against the brace of concrete. Through the narrow slot in her cover, the first suppressor leaned from his window in the far building, his weapon kicking in short bursts. She counted his rhythm. 3 bursts. Pause. Then another 3. On the pause, she exhaled, settled the crosshairs just below his cheekline, and squeezed. The recoil was a soft push against her shoulder, the sound drowned by the river's constant rush. The figure folded backward into the shadows, his weapon clattering out of sight. She did not linger on the result. The window was now an empty square of darkness, but other guns were still active. The second suppressor was crouched behind sandbags near the bridge approach. From her current angle, the rebar obscured his head and upper chest. She adjusted her position inch by inch, shifting her knees and elbows inside the cramped hide until she could find a narrow gap between two twisted beams. The movement was slow, deliberate, each scrape of fabric against concrete minimized. When the sight picture was clean, she took her time centering the reticle, waiting for him to rise slightly between bursts before sending the shot. He dropped out of sight, his rifle tipping sideways into the dirt. The third suppressor was the most cautious. He fired from behind the broken wall of the collapsed warehouse, exposing only his weapon and a sliver of helmet. Brooke kept him in her scope, watching for anything she could use. A flicker of sunlight passed over his cover as the cloud shifted, catching the edge of his visor. The glare made him lean instinctively to the side, just far enough to give her a target. She fired in that moment, the shot snapping him backward into the rubble. The effect on the enemy was immediate. Their firing slackened, then broke into uncoordinated bursts. Muzzle flashes appeared without pattern, some hitting high, others scattering wide. The precision that had kept her allies pinned was gone. Brooke worked the bolt in a fluid motion, the sound masked entirely by the river below. She kept her scope moving, scanning for any new threats pushing into the fight. A figure darted from the far bank's lower level toward the bridge approach, weapon in hand. Brooke led him slightly in her scope, let him clear the cover, and took the shot before he could reach position. Another enemy shifted in the upper window of the building that had held the first suppressor. She aimed and fired before he could bring his weapon to bear. Each engagement was a calculated decision, conserving ammunition while removing threats that could re-establish control over the field. The structure around her felt alive with tension, but now the tone had changed. The groans of steel and the creak of shifting concrete were steady and familiar, no longer competing with the sharp, oppressive rhythm of coordinated enemy fire. The bridge's shadows remained her shield, and she kept her profile tight behind the torn netting. Every movement she made was measured to avoid any glint or sudden shift that could give away her location. She took a moment to glance toward the trapped allies under the span. They were still in place, watching and waiting. One of them lifted a hand briefly, a signal they were ready to move when she gave the word. Brooke nodded once to herself and returned to scanning the far bank. The enemy's focus had shifted entirely to self-preservation, and that meant the corridor ahead was beginning to open. Still, she resisted the urge to rush. A fight could turn just as quickly in the other direction if she grew careless. She checked each firing lane again, pausing on any shadow or angle that seemed out of place. The sunlight continued to shift across the wreckage, and she watched how it touched different parts of the field, looking for glints off optics or helmets. Even without firing, the light had become an ally, its changes in brightness altering enemy behavior, revealing their positions without their knowing. The river's roar carried on beneath it all, masking her movements as she cycled the bolt or shifted slightly for a better view. In the confined space of her niche, the air was still thick with dust from earlier impacts, and her knees were stiff from holding the same position. She ignored the discomfort, keeping her focus on the next step. The battlefield was hers now, but it would stay that way only as long as she remained precise. One last target presented itself, a figure moving quickly across open ground near the warehouse. She tracked his pace, timed the shot to his stride, and ended his run with a single round. After that, the far bank fell still except for the occasional twitch of movement far in the background, too distant to pose immediate danger. The suppressive net had been broken. The advantage was now firmly in her hands, and the path to rescue was clear to be built. Brooke keyed her radio, keeping her voice low and steady. She told the trapped soldiers to be ready to move on her signal and to keep low no matter what happened. The reply was brief, just enough to confirm they had heard her. She scanned the far bank again, checking for any late shifts in enemy positions before she began. The suppressors were gone, but scattered resistance could still break the escape if she left gaps in her coverage. She timed her signal between bursts of distant fire, raising her voice just enough to cut through the static. The two allies emerged from their cover, one helping the other along with a sling improvised from webbing and a torn section of cloth. They moved quickly but kept low, using broken slabs and bent beams as shields. From her niche, Brooke followed their path with her scope, ready to drop anything that appeared in their line of travel. Movement flared at the edge of her vision. An enemy tried to reposition from behind a chunk of collapsed wall near the bridge approach. She fired once, the round striking the wall's edge close enough to make him retreat. That was enough to keep him from getting a clear angle on the Allies. She shifted back to tracking their progress, her rifle sweeping ahead of them to clear the next section of their route. They reached a point where her sightline narrowed, the debris blocking her from direct coverage. She adjusted by aiming at the most likely approach routes, firing short, controlled bursts to push any hidden threats deeper into cover. This created a zigzag corridor for the Allies, a series of safe spots where they could pause and gather themselves before making the next move. She switched between scanning the near side of each obstacle and the shadowed openings beyond, keeping the momentum alive. The wounded soldier stumbled once, forcing the other to slow. Brooke took that moment to fire at a figure who had edged too close from the far bank's lower level. The shot broke apart a section of brick near his head, sending him scrambling back. She did not wait to see if he stayed down. Her focus was already on the next stretch of open ground the Allies needed to cross. A burst of gunfire erupted from somewhere she had not expected, tearing into the rubble barely a meter from the moving pair. The sound was sharp and close, making the wounded man flinch hard. Brooke's eyes snapped to the source, finding a shadowed figure tucked behind a section of rebar. She could not get a clean line without threading her shot through the metal lattice. Holding her breath, she adjusted until the reticle settled on the narrow space between two bent rods. The round passed cleanly through, dropping the threat instantly. She let out her breath slowly, watching for any second shooter in the same area. None appeared, and the Allies kept moving, their pace steady now despite the injury. The corridor ahead opened wider, with fewer angles for the enemy to exploit. Brooke shifted to a broader Overwatch, ensuring no one could push in from the flanks. Her shots came less frequently now, but each one was placed to control space, not just targets. The pair reached the shadow of the retaining wall that marked the near side's safe zone. Brooke scanned the far bank one more time, making sure no last-minute attack would follow them. She saw movement deeper in the ruins, but too far to be an immediate threat. The rescue corridor had held intact from the first step to the last. She gave the all-clear over the radio, her voice calm despite the tension still humming in her muscles. The Allies disappeared into the cover of the wall, pulling the wounded man fully out of sight. Brooke stayed in her niche, eyes on the field, knowing the fight might not be over yet. For now, though, the line between danger and safety had been drawn, and she had kept it open long enough for them to cross. The field had gone still. No more muzzle flashes sparked from the far bank. No more bursts rattled through the air. Dust hung in pale columns where sunlight slipped between the bridge's broken girders, drifting slowly as if time itself had eased. Brooke kept her rifle steady on the same arcs she had watched throughout the fight, letting her eyes linger in shadowed corners until she was certain no late threat remained. The river's roar filled the silence left by gunfire, steady and relentless. It echoed under the span, carrying a cool mist toward her hide. The damp air clung to her face, washing away some of the grit. In that constant rush, she heard the fight's edge recede, leaving behind only the weight of what had been done. The bridge no longer felt like a cage around her. It had been her shield, and for the moment, it had held. She allowed herself one last slow sweep of the far side. Shapes moved deep in the ruins, too far to matter now. The enemy had pulled back, or at least decided not to press this ground again. Her allies were gone from her scope's view, already tucked behind the retaining wall on the near bank. She knew they were alive, and that was enough. Brooke shifted her weight and backed away from the narrow firing gap. The torn safety netting she had used for concealment sagged as she brushed past it. Her knees ached from the hours crouched in that cramped space, but she moved with care, keeping her profile low until she was certain she was clear. Each step back down through the twisted beams was measured, the way she had entered, her boots finding quiet footing. The crawl out felt different than the way in. The sharp angles of rebar and jagged concrete were the same, but now they carried no threat. She moved through them with the calm of someone who knew the path was hers. Sunlight shifted above her as clouds passed, casting flickers of light over the beams, bright for a moment, and then gone. The structure's groans seemed softer now, more like a weary settling than the strained tension she had felt before. When she reached the maintenance ladder, she paused for a moment, resting one gloved hand on the rusted rung. She listened to the water, to the low hum of wind threading through the wreckage. It felt like the bridge and the river had been witnesses to the fight, each holding their place while she worked. The bridge had given her cover. The river had masked her sound, both constant, both dangerous, yet both part of why the three of them were still breathing. She climbed down into the open, crossing the short stretch of broken ground to the retaining wall. The two soldiers looked up as she approached. One was still leaning on the other's shoulder, a dark patch on his sleeve where the bandage had soaked through. She gave them a single nod. Nothing more. They returned it without words, the shared understanding between them enough. Brooke looked once more toward the bridge, its bent steel and shattered concrete catching the late light. From this side, it seemed almost peaceful, the violence hidden in the stillness. She knew it could just as easily become a killing ground again. But for now it was quiet. The roar of the river carried on, indifferent to the fight that had played out above it. She adjusted the sling of her rifle and stepped past the wall, already turning her attention forward. The mission was not finished, and there was no reason to linger. The quiet was only ever temporary, but it was enough to know they had crossed through alive.